So now that you're familiar with the functions of the skeletal system, some of the main terms related to structures, we're going to start looking at the individual structures in the skeletal system. Specifically, we're going to start naming some of the bones in the skeletal system. Now, there's 206 bones in the adult human skeletal system. We are not going to learn the names of all of them. We are just going to learn the names of the major, most common bones that you need to know. So we're going to start with the axial skeleton. So by the end of this lesson, you should number one, know what the axial skeleton is, and number two, be able to name the common bones in the axial skeleton. So just like as we're looking at the body in different views, different parts, we divide it up in smaller sections to talk about it and to identify parts. We divide the skeletal system into two parts or two divisions. That is the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. Now, axial, when you hear that word axial, I want you to think of the word of an axis. And an axis is something through which other things revolve around. For example, you might remember back talking about the Earth has an axis, that it spins around an axis. So it has a central point, a central line that it turns around. So the axial bones are those in the center of the body. Then you have the appendicular, comes from the word appendage, which is something that hangs or hangs off of. It's an accessory to. So the appendicular bones are ones that hang off of the axial bones. So in these pictures, you can see in the one on the right here that the red is down the center of the body, and these are the bones and the structures of the axial skeleton. And then when you look at the appendicular bones in red, you can see they hang off of the axial skeleton. So two divisions of the skeletal system, axial and appendicular, and in this lesson we're going to focus on the axial bones. So structures in the axial skeleton. First, we'll start with the cranium. The cranium is the structures in the skull. And the medical term that we use for that is cranio. Now, there's a bunch of different bones that all come together to make this helmet-like structure in the cranium. But we're just going to know that we're just going to know its general term of the skull bones, and it's called the cranium. The next term is the mandible. Now, the mandible is the only movable bone in the head. And what do you call that? Your jawbone. Okay, so your jawbone is your mandible. I remember it, the mandible is movable. Kind of rhymes, and it helps me remember it. The next structure I want you to be familiar with in the axial skeleton is the sternum. Now the sternum is this center, almost flat kind of bone in the middle of your chest. And that's the bone that we push on when we're doing compressions, chest compressions in CPR. And then the next ones I want you to be familiar with, which you probably already are, but we're still going to review it, are the ribs. And your ribs form that cage that protect the heart and the lungs and those internal organs and your kidneys in the back. And The medical term for rib is costo. Now, don't get that confused with chondro. Chondro is the cartilage that we talked about around the ribs. Costo is the actual ribs themselves. So cranium, skull, mandible, jaw, sternum, breastbone, and ribs, ribs, or costo. Okay, the other part that we have in the axial skeleton is the spine or the spinal column. Now, the spine extends from the base of the head all the way down to your tailbone. And it has a lot of bones. Each individual bone is called a vertebra. Altogether, they're vertebrae. Now, they do have individual names, but when you know the sections, you will easily know the names of each of the bones. So, let's start at the top. The bones in the neck area are called the cervical vertebrae. Cervic means neck. So these are the cervical vertebrae. And how we name them individually is by their number. Number 1 is at the top, close to the head, and so that is called C1. And the one below that is called C2, and the one below that is called C3. You have a total of 5. So C1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are the individual names that we use for the cervical vertebrae. C for cervical, and then they're each numbered on their way down. The next group is the thoracic vertebrae, and the thoracic vertebrae are those in your chest area. Thorax, chest, thoracic. And they are named again the same way as we did with the cervical vertebrae. So the first one would be T1, then T2, T3, T4, T5, on down. So thoracic is chest, and again, they are called T and whatever number it is, starting superior to inferior. The next section of vertebrae is your low back. And the low back bones are called lumbar. Lumbar, low. Lumbar vertebrae, low back bones. Again, they are labeled the same in the same pattern. L, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Then the last set of bones are the sacral bones. Sacral. Now, this whole structure all together is called the sacrum. It's a group of bones that at one time were individual and now they are fused together. The whole thing together is called the sacrum. And guess how they're labeled? S, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I do want to point out one particular bone that has a special name. And that is the bone at the very, 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 very end of your spine. That's this little bone right here, and that's called the coccyx. Other word would be, you might call it the tailbone. And your tailbone is where we think at one time, if we had had a tail, that's where it would have been attached. So, practice makes permanent. Can you go through these bones now of the axial skeleton and name them top to bottom, bottom to top, randomly. Keep practicing until you get all their names down.